Tortured to death, the shocking end of William Wallace. Under the shadow of death in 1305 London. On the morning of August 23, 1305, London awoke to an eerie atmosphere, as if the city were holding its breath in anticipation of a storm. The cobblestone streets echoed with the clatter of horses' hooves, the cries of vendors hawking their wares, and the excited whispers of crowds gathering. The scent of smoke from bakeries mingled with the sweat and eagerness of thousands crammed into narrow alleys. They hadn't come to trade or dine. They had come to witness a spectacle that would haunt generations: the death of William Wallace, the unyielding Scottish hero, the sworn enemy of King Edward I, Longshanks, the ruthless Longlegs. That day, London was not merely a city. It was a vast stage where power was displayed through blood, and defiance was crushed under the blade. In the center of this horrific drama stood Wallace, a man who had once made an entire kingdom tremble. From an obscure landowner in the windswept lands of Scotland, he had risen to become a symbol of freedom, leading the rebellion at Stirling Bridge in 1297, where English forces were humiliated by his courage and cunning. But now, bound and bloodied, he was dragged through the rugged streets, his eyes still burning with an indomitable fire. Was this truly the end of a hero, or merely the beginning of a legend? Edward I, the king renowned for his cruelty, had turned this execution into a blood-drenched message to all of Scotland and beyond. This was not just a punishment. It was a meticulously orchestrated performance, a ritual of annihilation designed to erase not only a man, but the very idea of resistance he embodied. The chosen method, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was not merely a penalty. It was the pinnacle of medieval brutality, a means to strip away dignity, obliterate the soul, and reduce hope to ashes. Edward wanted everyone, from peasants to nobles, from Scotland to Europe, to understand that defying him meant stepping into an earthly hell. But what had led Wallace to this fateful moment? Scotland in the late 12th century was a land torn apart by war and betrayal. When the Scottish crown fell into crisis, Edward I saw a golden opportunity to swallow the northern kingdom, viewing it as a rebellious province rather than a sovereign nation. Wallace, driven by personal loss and a belief in freedom, rose not for power, but for a dream, a free Scotland. His victory at Stirling Bridge was not just a military feat. It was a spark that ignited the hearts of Scots, proving they could stand against the southern giant. Yet that same light made Wallace the prime target of an unrelenting manhunt. Edward I deployed a vast network of spies, offered lavish bounties, and coerced even his former allies to turn against him. The betrayal came from his own homeland, when Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had sworn allegiance to the cause of independence, led English forces to capture him near Glasgow. In the darkness, whispers of gold and survival had traded away the hero's freedom. As Wallace was bound and dragged away, he faced not only the enemy's blade, but the sting of betrayal from his own countrymen. As the procession reached London, the crowds roared, threw stones, and jeered. But in Wallace's eyes, witnesses said there was something beyond mere pain, a defiance, a declaration that he would never yield. Would he truly remain unbroken even as he stood at death's door? And would this horrific death extinguish Scotland's flame of resistance, or fan it into a blaze that would consume Edward's ambitions? As the noose tightened around his neck at Smithfield, and the executioner's blade gleamed, the answer would be written in blood, not only on London's cobblestones, but in the heart of a nation.
Part 2. Historical Context: The War for Independence and Personal Vendetta. The cobblestone streets of London, where William Wallace was dragged in humiliation on August 23, 1305, were not only witnesses to Edward I's brutality, they also carried the echoes of a war that had shaken an entire nation. Scotland's fight for independence, where dreams of freedom clashed with the swords of the English Empire. To understand why Wallace's death was staged as a horrific spectacle, we must journey back to a turbulent Scotland, where loyalty was tested by blood and fire, and an ordinary man became an unyielding symbol. But above all, this is a story of a deep-seated vendetta, not just between two nations, but between two men, Wallace, the warrior of freedom, and Edward I, the unrelenting king. A Scotland torn apart. In the late 13th century, Scotland was a land of unrest, where lush green hills and misty valleys concealed deep wounds. In 1286, the sudden death of King Alexander III without a direct heir plunged the kingdom into a succession crisis. Powerful clans vied for the throne, while whispers of war spread like cold winds from the highlands. Edward I, the ambitious English king, saw a golden opportunity to seize Scotland. Under the guise of mediating the dispute, he intervened, but his true intentions were clearer than the glint of a sword: to bring Scotland under English control. Edward did not view Scotland as an equal nation. To him, it was a rebellious province, a piece to be fitted into his kingdom. In 1292, he installed John Balliol as a puppet king, but Balliol soon became a powerless figurehead under Edward's manipulation. When Balliol attempted to resist, Edward responded by deposing him in 1296, claiming direct rule. English armies swept across the border, massacring civilians at Berwick with a brutality that shocked Europe. Scotland fell under the shadow of occupation, with castles seized, people oppressed, and national pride trampled. In that darkness, seeds of resistance began to sprout. Scottish lords, though divided by greed and fear, started to realize that submission did not guarantee survival. But it was not the nobles, but a man from a humbler background who ignited the flame of rebellion. William Wallace, a minor landowner from Elderslie, had no grand titles or mighty armies, but he possessed something many lacked: a heart ablaze with freedom and an unbreakable will. The rise of William Wallace. Wallace did not step into history with dreams of heroism. He was forged by loss and anguish. Under English occupation, his family suffered cruel injustices. Some accounts claim his father or brother was killed by English soldiers, and his wife, or betrothed, Marion Braveheart, was brutally murdered after he retaliated against an English official in Lanark. These stories, though tinged with legend, point to a truth. Wallace fought not for glory, but for what he had lost and what he believed Scotland could become. In 1297, Wallace rose up not with a trained army, but with farmers, craftsmen, and other oppressed folk weary of English cruelty. He led them with courage and cunning, turning Scotland's forests and marshes into weapons against the enemy. His pinnacle came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where the English army, superior in numbers and heavily armored, was trapped on a narrow bridge. Wallace, alongside Andrew Murray, another resistance leader, turned the terrain to their advantage, delivering a crushing blow that killed thousands of English soldiers and humiliated Edward I's reputation of invincibility. Stirling was more than a military triumph. It was a declaration that Scotland could rise, that farmers wielding pitchforks and knives could defeat knights in iron armor. Wallace became a beacon of hope, a torch illuminating the dark night of occupation. He was named Guardian of Scotland, a title that honored his deeds and entrusted him with safeguarding the dream of independence. But that same light made him Edward I's prime target, a king who never forgave humiliation. A personal vendetta between two men. If the war between England and Scotland was a clash of kingdoms, the confrontation between Edward I and William Wallace was far more personal. Edward, a tall, cold, and ambitious king, had built his reputation by crushing rebellions in Wales and expelling Jews from England. He saw himself as the embodiment of divine authority, untouchable. Wallace's victory at Stirling not only undermined his control over Scotland, but struck at his pride. To Edward, Wallace was not just a rebel. He was a living reminder that a king's power could be challenged by an ordinary man. Edward understood that to extinguish Scotland's flame of resistance, he had to destroy not only Wallace, but the idea he represented. He had seen other rebellions in Wales, in Ireland, and knew that if not decisively crushed, the fire could spread. Wallace, with his ability to inspire and unite common folk, was greater threat than any Scottish lord. Edward did not want Wallace to merely die. He wanted him annihilated, transformed into a horrific lesson for anyone dreaming of freedom. In contrast, Wallace did not fight out of personal hatred for Edward, but he understood what the king represented: a system of oppression where Scots were stripped of their lands, dignity, and right to live freely. In the long nights on Scotland's hills, as campfires flickered, Wallace perhaps thought of loved ones lost, villages burned, and children growing up under the English yoke. Each victory, each battle, was a statement that Scotland would not yield and that he would fight to his last breath. The relentless manhunt. After the defeat at Stirling, Edward I became obsessed with capturing Wallace. He deployed a vast network of spies, from Scottish castles to border taverns. The bounty on Wallace's head grew daily, enough to turn any impoverished farmer into a wealthy man. Edward also used divide-and-conquer tactics, rewarding Scottish lords who surrendered while threatening those who dared shelter Wallace. Many lords, weary of war and fearful of England's might, began turning against the resistance. Wallace, now a fugitive, lived like a ghost, moving from forest to marsh, from remote village to secret hideout, relying on the loyalty of common folk who still believed in him. But even loyalty has its limits when death looms. Former allies, who once fought beside him at Stirling, were gradually bought or coerced. Each step Wallace took on Scottish soil was a step on a knife's edge, with the risk of betrayal ever present. The final betrayal came in August 1305, near Glasgow, where he believed he had found safe refuge. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had once sworn allegiance to the cause of independence, had changed sides. Under English pressure and tempted by gold, Menteith led troops to surround Wallace in the dead of night. The details of that moment remain shrouded, but one can imagine Wallace, roused by footsteps and torchlight, drawing his sword with eyes both pained and defiant. He fought, as he always did, but fate was sealed. The noose tightened around his neck, and Scotland's hero was dragged away, not toward a battlefield, but toward London, where Edward I awaited to complete his masterpiece of cruelty. Connecting to destiny. As Wallace was bound and dragged through England's roads, his gaze, as witnesses recounted, remained unwavering. In him was the image of a free Scotland, a dream he knew he might never live to see. But Edward I, in his rage and pride, failed to realize that each drop of Wallace's blood on London soil was not an end, but a seed for a new resistance. The hunt for Wallace had ended, but his story, and Scotland's, was only beginning. As the noose was prepared at Smithfield, and the executioner's blade gleamed, Wallace's destiny would be written not in submission, but in defiance.
Part 3. Betrayal and the Journey to London. Darkness enveloped the lands near Glasgow on a night in August 1305, when William Wallace, The hero who had once made an entire kingdom tremble was ensnared by his own countrymen. Whispers of betrayal, sharp as a cold blade, severed his last thread of hope. Part 2 led us through the fire of resistance Wallace kindled at Stirling Bridge, through the personal vendetta between him and Edward I, and through the relentless manhunt that turned him into a ghost in his own homeland. Now, as flickering torches pierced the night, and the sound of soldiers' footsteps echoed, the story turns to a new chapter, one of betrayal, a torturous journey to London, and a man facing his fate with eyes that never wavered. A Ghost in the Night, the betrayal of Sir John Menteith. After the defeat at Falkirk in 1298, where Wallace's forces were overwhelmed by English archers and cavalry, he became an outlaw, moving from deep forests to hidden caves, from remote villages to secret hideouts. But despite being hunted, his spirit remained an unquenchable flame. The people of Scotland, from impoverished farmers to loyal warriors, still whispered his name like a prayer, a symbol of hope amidst the darkness of occupation. But Edward I, with the ruthlessness and patience of a predator, knew that even the greatest heroes could be felled by betrayal from within. The betrayal came from Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had once sworn allegiance to the cause of independence. But prolonged war and Edward's threats had shaken the loyalty of many. Menteith, tempted by gold, power, and promises of survival, chose to side with the enemy. Historical records vary on the details of the betrayal, but one can imagine the moment, a moonless night, when Wallace, exhausted from months of evasion, sought refuge at a farm near Glasgow. In the shadows, whispers between Menteith and English spies led soldiers to his exact location. The wind howled through the trees as if warning him, but it was too late. As soldiers surrounded him, Wallace drew his sword, its steel glinting in the torchlight. He fought, as he always had, with the courage of a man with nothing left to lose. But this time the enemy's numbers were overwhelming, and the rope that tightened around his neck was not a battlefield weapon, but a symbol of betrayal. As he was bound and dragged away, Wallace perhaps looked into Menteith's eyes, not with hatred, but with a profound sorrow, the sorrow of a man realizing his homeland was divided not only by swords, but by greed and fear. This betrayal was not just a personal failure for Wallace. It symbolized the fracture within Scotland, where loyalty was tested by survival. Edward I understood this. He did not merely want to capture Wallace. He wanted to turn the hero's downfall into a lesson for all of Scotland, that even the mightiest could be broken by treachery from their own kin. A torturous journey to London. After his capture, Wallace was not taken directly to London in silence. Edward I, with calculated cruelty, turned his journey into the first public spectacle, a ritual to strip the hero of dignity before the blade touched his flesh. Wallace was tightly bound, his hands and feet chained, and placed on a wooden frame, a hurdle, dragged by horses over rough roads from Scotland to London. The journey lasted weeks, through muddy fields, small towns, and bustling cities, where crowds gathered to see the rebel brought low. Each hoofbeat was a dagger to Wallace's body. The stones and mud of the road tore at his flesh, leaving trails of dried blood on the earth. But physical pain was not the only torment he endured. Edward I had ordered the soldiers to pause at the most populous places, from Carlisle to York, from Nottingham to London's outskirts, so the people could witness the infamous Scottish rebels' humiliation. The crowds, spurred by English propaganda, hurled stones, refuse, and insults at Wallace. "Traitor!" they screamed, while others, perhaps curious or reveling in cruelty, laughed as if watching a spectacle. Yet among the crowds were silent gazes, tear-streaked faces of exiled Scots, who saw in Wallace not just a bound man, but the dream of a nation.
Some recounted that, despite his chains, Wallace's eyes remained steadfast as if looking through the throng beyond the city walls to a free Scotland he had sacrificed everything to protect. These moments, though not clearly recorded in history, became part of his legend, a man who never bowed, even his body was dragged through the dirt. This journey was not only physical torture, but a psychological battle. Edward I, with a deep understanding of power, knew that to destroy a symbol, he had to shatter its image in the public's eyes. By parading Wallace through towns, turning him into a humiliated spectacle, Edward aimed to erase the invincible hero and replace him with a defeated, weak figure. But he underestimated the strength of Wallace's spirit. Though bloodied and weary, his gaze remained unbroken, a final act of defiance. Wallace's inner resolve, an unquenchable flame. During the long days of being dragged on the hurdle, amidst jeers and pain, Wallace's mind likely wandered to memories of the past. He recalled days in Elderslie, growing up among green fields and tales of freedom. He thought of Marion, the woman he loved, killed by English hands. He remembered the warriors who stood by him at Stirling Bridge, sharing bread and laughter by campfires. Above all, he held on to the dream of a Scotland unshackled, a dream he knew he might never live to see. These thoughts, though not recorded in history, defined Wallace's greatness. He was not just a warrior, he was the embodiment of an unbreakable will. In quiet moments between bouts of pain, he may have wondered if his sacrifices were worth it. But each jeer from the crowd, each stone thrown, seemed to renew his strength. He did not beg for mercy, nor bow to his oppressors. Instead, he stood tall, at least in his mind, declaring that the body could be destroyed, but the spirit could not. The soldiers escorting him, trained to treat him as a criminal, were sometimes unnerved by his defiant silence. Some oral tales claim a few English guards, though enemies, began to feel reluctant respect for this man who, even in chains, exuded an unshakable dignity. But Edward I cared nothing for dignity. He wanted Wallace broken, physically and spiritually, before the executioner's blade touched him. London, the final destination. When Wallace finally reached London, the city was primed for the final act. The walls of the Tower of London, where he was held in his last days, loomed as a symbol of English power. Even in the dungeon's darkness, Wallace remained a threat. Guards were ordered to watch him closely, as if fearing that even chained, he could spark a rebellion. News of his arrival spread quickly, and crowds began gathering outside, eager for the execution day. Edward I had meticulously planned what would follow. The trial at Westminster Hall, held on August 23rd, would be a legal farce to legitimize his cruelty. But before that, the journey from the Tower to Westminster would be another spectacle, with Wallace dragged through the city's busiest streets. The crowds, inflamed by propaganda, screamed and threw refuse, but among them were those who stood silently, their eyes filled with pain as they watched Scotland's hero humiliated. As the hurdle dragged Wallace over the cobblestones, his blood stained the ground, leaving a trail like a testament to his fight. But even in his darkest moment, he did not bow. His gaze, as witnesses recounted, remained forward, as if seeing a future Edward I could not touch. This journey, meant to destroy him, inadvertently highlighted his spirit's strength, a spirit that would live on even as his body was torn apart at Smithfield. Connecting to destiny. The journey from Scotland to London, with all the pain and humiliation, was the prelude to the horrific spectacle Edward I had prepared. But in that cruelty, he failed to see that each drop of Wallace's blood on the ground was not a sign of defeat, but a seed for a new resistance. As Wallace stood before Westminster Hall, ready to face a sham trial, he was not just a chained man, he was a symbol of a nation, and his story, though nearing its bloody end, would echo forever in the hearts of the Scots.
Part 4. The Sham Trial, a Legal Farce. As William Wallace stepped out of Westminster Hall on the morning of August 23, 1305, his chains clinking on the stone floor, his eyes still burned with an unquenchable fire. Part 3 took us through the cruel betrayal by Sir John Menteith, through the torturous journey from Scotland to London, where he was paraded as a humiliated spectacle before the crowds. But Edward I, with his calculated ruthlessness, was not satisfied with destroying Wallace's body. He sought to obliterate his spirit and legacy, and Westminster Hall, with its cold stone walls and stifling air, would be the stage for the final legal farce, a sham trial designed to legitimize his brutality. This was not justice, it was a public ritual to transform Wallace from a symbol of resistance into a condemned criminal. Westminster Hall, the stage of power. Westminster Hall, a grand structure with towering stone columns and an ancient wooden roof, was the heart of English power in the 14th century. On August 23, 1305, the air inside the hall was heavy, like a storm about to break. Dim light from high windows cast long shadows across the intricately carved walls, as if history itself were watching. The judges, appointed by Edward I, sat on ornate chairs, their black robes fluttering like the wings of ravens. A crowd of nobles, merchants, and selected commoners packed the hall, whispering with a mix of excitement and unease. They had not come for truth, they had come to witness the fall of a man who had made an entire kingdom tremble. But Edward I, with his calculated ruthlessness, was not satisfied with destroying Wallace's body. He sought to obliterate his spirit and legacy, and Westminster Hall, with its cold stone walls and stifling air, would be the stage for the final legal farce, a sham trial designed to legitimize his brutality. This was not justice, it was a public ritual to transform Wallace from a symbol of resistance into a condemned criminal. A legal farce staged. The trial began with the thud of a wooden staff, signaling silence. A clerk with a dry voice read the charges in Latin, a language Wallace, though intelligent, likely did not fully understand. This was not an accident. Using Latin was a way to exclude Wallace from the legal process, rendering him a stranger to his own fate. The charges were listed with false solemnity: treason, murder, robbery, sacrilege, and destruction of English property. Each accusation rang out like a hammer blow, designed to drown Wallace in a sea of guilt. Treason was the cornerstone of the indictment, but it was also the most contentious point. Wallace, a Scot who had never sworn allegiance to Edward I, was accused of betraying a king he did not recognize. The irony was not lost on those present, especially a few scholars and foreign diplomats in the crowd, who whispered about the legitimacy of the charge. But in Westminster Hall, justice was not the goal. The goal was submission, and the judges, with cold eyes, had clear instructions. Wallace must be convicted, and his death must be a horrific lesson. When given the chance to speak, Wallace stood tall, though his chains weighed down his body. His voice, though hoarse from days of captivity, resonated through the hall. According to historical accounts, he declared firmly, "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." These words, like a bolt of lightning, cut through the stifling air. The crowd stirred, some shouting in anger, but others were stunned by his courage. This was not a plea for mercy. It was a defiance, a proclamation that Scotland was an independent nation, and that Wallace fought not for crime, but for freedom. Wallace's declaration was a blow to Edward I's plan. Instead of appearing as a repentant criminal, he stood as a symbol of resistance, leaving the judges flustered and the crowd divided. Some began to question, could a man willing to die for his beliefs truly be a traitor? But Edward had anticipated such defiance. The judges swiftly moved to other charges, murder and sacrilege, to paint Wallace as a violent brigand rather than a warrior for freedom.
They recounted his attacks on English soldiers, the destruction of castles, and even accused him of assaulting clergy, though evidence was scant. The climactic moment, Wallace's defiance. Despite the overwhelming accusations and hostility, Wallace did not bow. He did not contest each charge, nor beg for leniency. Instead, he stood there, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, as if speaking to both the present and the future. Some recounted that in a brief silence before the sentence was pronounced, he gave a faint smile, not of arrogance, but of a man who knew his story would not end within these walls. That smile, though perhaps apocryphal, became part of his legend, a symbol of defiance before overwhelming power. The sentence, as expected, was merciless. The chief judge, with a cold voice, declared that Wallace would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the punishment for treason, designed not only to kill, but to erase the human body. Each part of the penalty held symbolic meaning. Hanging signified rejection by heaven, drawing and disemboweling destroyed the soul, and quartering obliterated the body. The crowd cheered as the sentence was read, but amid the noise there were whispers of unease. Some began to realize that the cruelty of this punishment was aimed not just at Wallace, but at anyone daring to dream of freedom. Wallace showed no reaction as the sentence was pronounced. He stood motionless, like a rock amidst a flood. But his eyes, as witnesses recounted, never left the judges, as if he was judging them, not the other way around. This moment was the trial's climax, not because of the sentence, but because Wallace's defiance had turned a legal farce into a stage for courage. Edward I wanted Wallace subdued, but instead he had created an immortal symbol. The trial's impact. The trial, though staged to humiliate Wallace, failed to erase his legacy. For the English present, it reinforced Edward I's image as an uncompromising king, ready to crush any challenger. But for the Scots in the crowd, and those who heard of the trial later, it was a reminder of freedom's cost. Wallace's declaration that he was never Edward's subject spread through whispers from London to Scotland's Highlands, becoming a new spark for the resistance movement. Foreign diplomats present to observe the trial carried the story of England's brutality to European courts. Some were horrified by the sentence's harshness, but others saw it as a sign of desperation, that Edward I, though powerful, still feared a man like Wallace. The trial, instead of bolstering his authority, inadvertently highlighted England's ruthlessness, contributing to the diplomatic isolation England would face in later years. In the hearts of the Scots, the trial marked a turning point. Many lords who had chosen submission to Edward I began questioning their decisions. Robert the Bruce, who would later become Scotland's king, was reportedly deeply affected by the trial and Wallace's defiance. For him, and for many others, Wallace was not just a condemned man, he was a symbol of an unyielding Scotland willing to pay the ultimate price for freedom. Connecting to destiny. As Wallace was led out of Westminster Hall, his chains clinking on the stone floor, he knew his journey was nearing its end. But the trial, with all its falsity and cruelty, had failed to break his spirit. Instead, it had made him a symbol more powerful than ever. As crowds gathered outside, eager for the execution at Smithfield, they did not know that Wallace's death would not be an end, but the beginning of a legend. The executioner's blade was sharpened, but the fire Wallace had kindled would burn on, from London streets to Scotland's hills and beyond.
Part 5. The Execution. The Pinnacle of Brutality. As William Wallace was led from Westminster Hall on the morning of August 23, 1305, his chains clinking on the stone floor, his eyes still burned with an unquenchable fire. Part 4 guided us through the Sham trial, where Edward I attempted to brand the Scottish hero a cursed criminal. But Wallace's defiance turned the legal farce into a stage for courage. Now, as he was dragged through London's crowded streets to Smithfield, the final stage was set, not for justice, but for a horrific spectacle designed to destroy both his body and legacy. Yet in that brutality, Wallace would prove that even death could not break the spirit of a man fighting for freedom. The procession through London, the road of humiliation. The journey from Westminster Hall to Smithfield was a ritual meticulously calculated by Edward I to maximize humiliation. Wallace, still bound to a wooden frame, a hurdle dragged by horses, was pulled over London's rough cobblestone streets. Each stone tore at his flesh, leaving trails of dried blood, a testament to his suffering from the journey from Scotland. But this was not mere physical torment. Edward wanted to turn Wallace into an exhibit, a living warning to anyone daring to defy English power. Crowds lined the bustling streets from Cheapside's market to the narrow alleys near Smithfield. They were a mix of curiosity, hatred, and fascination with death. Street vendors wove through the throng, hawking bread, ale, and roasted meat, turning the execution day into a macabre festival. Laughter, jeers, and shouts rang out as Wallace was dragged past, his blood dripping onto the ground, mingling with London's dust. Some threw stones and refuse, echoing propaganda that branded him a traitor, a murderer. But among them were silent gazes, exiled Scots, common folk sensing injustice, and even a few English who began to question whether this brutality was truly justice. Wallace, though exhausted and in pain, did not bow. Witnesses recounted that his eyes swept over the crowd not with fear or resentment, but with an almost otherworldly resolve. Some said he seemed to look beyond the throng, to Scotland's hills, to loved ones lost, to a dream of freedom he knew he would never see. His defiant silence unnerved some jeerers, as if they sensed that this chained man was stronger than all of them combined. The procession was deliberately prolonged, with stops at crowded intersections to ensure as many people as possible could witness Wallace's downfall. Edward I, though absent, had ordered the soldiers to make each step a dagger to Scotland's pride. But he underestimated the power of a symbol. Each drop of Wallace's blood on the ground was not a sign of defeat, but a promise that his story would not end here. Smithfield, a festival of death. As the procession reached Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, the air grew more oppressive than ever before. A large scaffold had been erected, looming over a sea of people. The crowd here was larger, louder, and more frenzied. They jostled for the best vantage points, shouting insults and laughing as if at a performance. Stalls selling food and drink dotted the area, the smell of roasted meat and ale mingling with sweat and excitement. This was not just an execution, it was a public event, a festival designed to reinforce Edward I's power and turn Wallace's death into entertainment. The scaffold was surrounded by guards, ensuring no one could interfere. At its center stood the executioner, a man with his face hidden beneath a hood, his hands seasoned in the art of inflicting pain. A fire had been prepared, its flames flickering like a prophecy of what was to come. Wallace was dragged onto the scaffold, his body trembling from exhaustion, but still standing tall. The crowd fell silent for a brief moment as he appeared, as if overwhelmed by the presence of the man they had been taught to hate. But the silence was quickly shattered by cheers. "Traitor! Murderer!" they screamed, their voices egged on by English soldiers and officials mingled in the crowd. But among them were other eyes, Scots standing quietly at the edges, clenching their fists, tears silently falling. Some whispered prayers, as if sending Wallace's soul to a place beyond Edward I's reach. The execution process, a ritual of cruelty. The executioner, with terrifying professionalism, tied a rope around Wallace's neck, but the rope was deliberately positioned to cause strangulation, not a quick neck break, a method to prolong agony. As Wallace was hoisted, his body writhed in the air,
his face turning purple, his breaths becoming hoarse groans. The crowd cheered, some laughing loudly, but others grew uneasy, realizing this was not just death, but orchestrated torture. Just as Wallace neared unconsciousness, the executioner cut the rope, letting him collapse onto the scaffold, still alive, still aware. His gasping breaths echoed amidst the crowd's noise, a reminder that he had not yet yielded. But the most horrific part of the execution was only beginning. The executioner, with a gleaming, sharp knife, approached Wallace. A swift, precise cut opened his abdominal. Wallace's scream, if any, was drowned by the crowd's cheers, but those closest recounted it as a sound not of this world, a cry from the depths of human suffering. With chilling calm, the executioner began pulling out his entrails one by one, holding them aloft for the crowd before tossing them into the nearby fire. The smell of burning flesh and blood filled the air, causing some in the crowd to turn away, while others shouted in sick excitement. In medieval thought, burning the entrails symbolized the destruction of emotion and compassion, reducing the victim to something less than human. But even in this horrific moment, Wallace remained alive, his eyes open as if defying death itself. Finally, when his body could endure no more, the executioner raised an axe. A single sharp blow ended Wallace's life, blood spurting from his neck, his head rolling onto the scaffold. The crowd erupted in cheers, but some began to retreat, shocked by the brutality they had witnessed. Wallace's head was held aloft, blood still dripping, before being preserved in tar for display on London Bridge. His body was then hacked into 4 quarters, each piece displayed like butcher's meat, ready to be sent to cities like Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, a warning to would-be rebels. The crowd's reaction and immediate legacy. The crowd's reaction at Smithfield was a complex tapestry of emotions. For many English, the execution was a triumph, a reaffirmation of Edward I's power. They laughed, drank, and saw Wallace's death as a successful spectacle. But among them, some grew uneasy. The punishment's brutality, especially disemboweling a living man, made some question whether this was justice or a king's vengeance. The Scots in the crowd, though few, stood silently, some weeping quietly, their hearts filled with pain and respect for the hero who had given everything. The execution's cruelty, designed by Edward I to crush Scotland's spirit, backfired. Instead of destroying Wallace's legacy, it transformed him into a martyr. News of his death spread swiftly from London's taverns to remote Highland villages, carried by whispers around campfires and songs of bards. To many Scots, Wallace's death was not an end, but a call to action. Robert the Bruce, who would later become Scotland's king, was reportedly moved by the execution's brutality, seeing in it the true face of English rule. Connecting to destiny. The execution at Smithfield was the pinnacle of Edward I's cruelty, but it was also the beginning of a legend. Each cut of the blade, each drop of Wallace's blood was not just the destruction of a man, but the sowing of a new resistance. As his head was placed on London Bridge and his body parts sent to Scottish cities, Edward I thought he had won, but he was mistaken. Wallace's legacy, forged in pain and defiance, would endure, inspiring future generations and shaping a nation's fate. From Smithfield's ashes, a new fire would rise, and Wallace's story would echo on, not just in Scotland, but across the world.
Part 6. Aftermath and Legacy. As the flames at Smithfield died down on the afternoon of August 23, 1305, leaving the stench of smoke and blood lingering in the air, the execution of William Wallace appeared to have achieved Edward I's aim, to turn the Scottish hero into a gruesome warning for all who dared defy English rule. Part 5 took us through the horrific execution, where Edward I, with calculated cruelty, sought to destroy not only Wallace's body, but his legacy. Wallace's blood stained London's earth. His head was hung on London Bridge, and his body parts were sent far and wide as ghastly trophies. But Edward I, in his arrogance, failed to foresee that this brutality, rather than extinguishing the flame of resistance, fanned it into an uncontrollable blaze. From the ashes of Smithfield, a legend was born, and Wallace's story would resonate forever, not only in Scotland, but across the globe. Immediate aftermath: Edward I's failure. The execution of William Wallace was designed by Edward I as a final blow to Scotland's resistance movement. By turning his death into a public spectacle, Edward aimed to send a clear message. Defying English authority meant total annihilation. Wallace's head, preserved in tar and displayed on London Bridge, was a chilling warning to any who dreamed of freedom. His body quarters, sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, were blood-soaked reminders of rebellion's consequences. In the days following the execution, many Scots, especially lords who had submitted to Edward, fell into fear and despair. Some fled the country, while others calculated that no ideal was worth such a horrific death. But Edward I, though a brilliant strategist, made a grave miscalculation. The execution's brutality did not just quell resistance, it transformed Wallace into a martyr. News of his death spread rapidly, from London's inns to remote Scottish villages. Minstrels, with their haunting melodies, recounted the tale of a hero who defied an empire and faced death unbowed. Whispers around campfires, poems crafted in the shadows, and silent prayers in small churches turned Wallace from a defeated warrior into a symbol of enduring hope. Among those most profoundly moved was Robert the Bruce, who would later become Scotland's king. According to some sources, Wallace's death had a powerful impact on him, highlighting English rule's cruelty and strengthening his resolve to continue the fight for independence. The execution, rather than weakening the resistance, became a rallying cry. It reminded Scots that submission to Edward I was not a path to peace, but a humiliating indignity. From this, a new form of warfare emerged, a relentless struggle where Scottish fighters preferred death in battle over capture and a fate like Wallace's. International impact, a double-edged message. Wallace's execution was not just a domestic event. It reverberated across Europe. Diplomats, merchants, and travelers present in London witnessed or heard of the event, and news quickly reached courts in France, Norway, and beyond. In a medieval world where information traveled swiftly along trade routes and diplomatic missions, the story of Edward I's brutality became part of England's reputation. Some kingdoms were horrified by the punishment's severity, particularly the act of disemboweling a living man, a deed seen as crossing the bounds of justice even in the brutal 14th century. For nations like France, often at odds with England, the execution was an opportunity to paint Edward I as a tyrant, damaging his diplomatic standing. Later historians noted that the execution's cruelty contributed to England's isolation in international relations, making potential allies wary of partnering with a nation willing to employ such extreme measures. Yet at the same time, the story of Wallace's courage, a man who stood tall before judges and faced death without begging, inspired resistance movements elsewhere. In Ireland, Wales, and even parts of Europe, Wallace's name became a symbol of defiance against oppressive power. Ending legacy, from warrior to legend. Wallace's execution is not immediate aftermath. History, poets, and artists transformed Wallace into a symbol of courage and sacrifice, a hero willing to pay the ultimate price for freedom. Medieval ballads, like The Wallace by Blind Harry, embellished some details of his life, but highlighted his unyielding spirit. These tales, passed down through generations, kept Wallace's flame alive in Scottish hearts. Wallace's death
also profoundly influenced concepts of human rights and international law. Later legal scholars, particularly during the Enlightenment, cited his execution as an example of judicial cruelty that exceeded moral bounds. The idea that even state enemies deserved basic dignity began to take shape, partly as a reaction to cases like Wallace's. Though these concepts were centuries from being codified, his death laid early groundwork for discussions of human rights. In culture, Wallace's story transcended Scotland's borders. From folk songs to modern literature, from paintings to films like Braveheart 1995, his image has been reimagined countless times, each iteration bringing new meaning to different generations. The execution scene, with its horror, became a powerful symbol of the struggle between oppression and freedom, tyranny and justice. It reminds viewers that the greatest victories are often not military, but moral, that dignity can be preserved even when all else is stripped away. The psychological impact on the Scottish people was profound and lasting. Wallace's execution created a collective trauma, a shared memory of suffering that united the nation in ways military triumphs could not. His death became a source of strength, proving some causes were worth suffering for, and that dignity could be maintained even in ultimate degradation. The stories of his courage, told in crofts, by campfires, and in songs, became part of Scotland's identity, a reminder that freedom always has a price, and those who pay it are never forgotten. Connecting to the future. William Wallace's execution at Smithfield was not an end, but the beginning of a greater story. As his head was hung on London Bridge and his body parts were sent far and wide, Edward I believed he had extinguished Scotland's resistance, but he was wrong. From Smithfield's ashes, a new movement was sparked, led by figures like Robert the Bruce, who would lead Scotland to victory at Bannockburn in 1314. Wallace's legacy, forged in pain and blood, became a guiding light for future generations, not only in Scotland, but wherever people dared to stand against oppression. As we look back to London's cobblestone streets, still stained with Wallace's blood, we realize his story is not just history. It is a call, a reminder that the human spirit, even when broken, can inspire the world to change.
Part 7. Conclusion. The Immortal Symbol of Freedom. As the flames at Smithfield flickered out in the afternoon of August 23, 1305, leaving behind the acrid smell of smoke and blood in the air, the execution of William Wallace seemed to have fulfilled Edward I's goal, to transform the Scottish hero into a blood-soaked warning for anyone daring to defy English authority. Part 6 guided us through the immediate aftermath of his death, from the initial fear gripping the Scots to the rise of a renewed resistance movement, from its international repercussions to Wallace's enduring legacy as a martyr. But Wallace's story did not end on the scaffold at Smithfield, nor did it cease on London Bridge, where his head was displayed as a gruesome trophy. From the ashes of brutality, a legend was born, a flame that continues to illuminate the path for those who yearn for freedom. Wallace's journey from warrior to icon stands as proof that even in destruction, the human spirit can triumph, and the greatest sacrifices often lead to the most profound victories. Reflecting on the horror, a failed spectacle. The execution of William Wallace was the pinnacle of medieval brutality, a ritual designed by Edward I to not only kill a man, but to eradicate the notion of resistance he embodied. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, each step of this punishment was symbolic, aimed at stripping away dignity, obliterating the soul, and destroying the body. His head, preserved in tar and hung on London Bridge, was a cold reminder of Edward's power. His body quarters, sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, were blood-drenched messages to paralyze the Scottish spirit.
Edward I believed that by turning Wallace's death into a public festival, he would extinguish all hope of an independent Scotland. But Edward underestimated the power of a symbol. The execution's brutality, rather than destroying Wallace's legacy, elevated him to new heights. In Scottish eyes, he was not a defeated traitor, but a martyr who had given everything for freedom. His blood on London's cobblestones was not a mark of failure, but seeds sown for a new resistance. Robert the Bruce, inspired by Wallace's courage, carried on the fight, leading Scotland to victory at Bannockburn in 1314, a triumph Wallace, though not alive to see, helped lay the foundation for. Edward I's failure lay in his inability to grasp that cruelty could subdue the body, but not the spirit. Each cut of the executioner's blade, each cheer from the crowd only amplified Wallace's story. Those who witnessed the execution, whether English or Scottish, carried memories of his courage, a man who, though chained and tortured, stood tall and defied an empire. This tale passed through ballads, whispers by campfires, and minstrel songs, became part of Scotland's identity, a reminder that freedom is always worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Timeless significance, freedom and sacrifice. William Wallace's story is not just a chapter in Scottish history, it is a universal tale of the struggle between oppression and freedom, tyranny and justice. His execution, with all its horror, poses an enduring question: what makes a hero? Wallace was not a king or a lord with boundless power. He was an ordinary man, born to a minor landowning family, driven by personal loss and belief in a greater ideal. He fought not for fame or power, but for a dream, a Scotland free from the chains of an invader's yoke. Wallace's sacrifice reminds us that freedom is never free. London's cobblestone streets, stained with his blood, testify to the price paid by those before us so we might enjoy freedoms often taken for granted today. His story challenges us to ask, how much are we willing to sacrifice for the principles we hold dear? In a modern world where struggles for justice and freedom persist, from civil rights movements to battles against inequality, Wallace's tale resonates as a call to action. Moreover, Wallace's execution raises profound questions about the nature of power and cruelty. The crowd at Smithfield, cheering and laughing at his suffering, were not monsters, but ordinary people, conditioned by state power to accept and even celebrate brutality. The executioner's actions, the officials organizing the event, and the crowd's complicity serve as a warning that the line between civilization and barbarity is always thinner than we think. Relevance to the modern world. In today's world, William Wallace's story remains strikingly relevant. Though medieval torture methods have faded into history, the struggle between oppression and freedom continues in new forms. From protests for social justice to movements for national independence, Wallace's spirit, the willingness to stand against injustice, even at great cost, inspires millions. His story reminds us that the greatest victories are not those won on battlefields, but those of the spirit, when a man, though chained and tortured, can inspire a nation. From London's cobblestone streets, where his blood once flowed, to Scotland's verdant hills, Wallace's story continues to echo. It reminds us that freedom is an ideal worth sacrificing for, that dignity can be preserved in the darkest moments, and that the human spirit, though broken, can inspire future generations. Edward I may have won that day, but Wallace triumphed in history. His legacy, forged in pain and blood, is an eternal call. Stand up, fight, and never abandon the dream of a juster world. As we reflect on William Wallace's horrific execution, we see not just a man destroyed, but a nation reborn, an ideal ignited, and a story that continues to inspire humanity. His death reminds us that great principles, freedom, justice, dignity, are always worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And in each of us, Wallace's story sparks a question. When faced with oppression, will we rise or submit? The answer, as Wallace showed, lies in the courage of every human heart.